and was the university's nominee for the Rhodes and Marshall scholarships. A musicologist and musician, she currently serves as Director of Musical Activities for the Catholic Chapel at the United States Military Academy at West Point. She's portrayed Greenhow for museums, historical societies, roundtables, and educational institutions throughout the United States, including the International Spy Museum, several National Park Service sites, and the Surratt Society, and at book launch events for Ann Blackman's biography, Wild Rose, which I think was one of our raffle books back there. Her talk is supported by the Massey Charitable Trust, and as always, we thank them for their support. I don't know how many of you follow Emily on Facebook, her author page, but she has been burning up the roads supporting this book this year. Really impressive, the number of talks that she has put in. It is an impressive book. We do have a copy downstairs in our collection, but I would encourage all of you to pick up a copy for yourselves and to speak with Emily after the program here. But ladies and gentlemen, Emily Lapisardi. Thanks.
Thank you. As I was standing there looking around, I was reminded of an incident in Rose Greenhow's life. In January 1862, she was taken from her home where she was under house arrest to the old Capitol prison. And she was kept waiting in a room to meet the superintendent, which was the room in which she had sat at the bedside of John C. Calhoun as he was dying. The old Capitol prison had been her aunt and uncle's boarding house, and Calhoun stayed there quite frequently and died there. She writes in My Imprisonment that being in that room, she was surrounded by a flood of memories. That's what it is for me to be here. My association with this venue goes back more than 20 years. And certainly for me in this space, there is a flood of memories. And it is so good to see some longtime friends here as well, whom I've missed and whom I have not seen in quite a few years since I went to West Point about 4 years ago to accept the position there. Hopefully you will not be imprisoning me for the next several months. So in that respect, it may be somewhat different than Rose's experience at the old Capitol. So this book was the result of 25 years of research and about 5 years of active writing. For those of you who may not be terribly familiar with Mrs. Greenhow, I will give you a brief overview of who she was first. And then I would like to discuss some of the surprises I encountered in those 25 years of research leading up to the publication of the book. So if you are familiar with Rose, it is most likely as one of the most famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, Civil War spies. She was notoriously secretive about her age. Even under oath, she refused to state it in the Lehman-Tor trial in San Francisco. The best we can tell, she was born about 1814 or 1815 in Montgomery County, Maryland. Her father died when she was a child, and she was sent to live with her aunt and uncle who ran a boarding house for politicians in Washington, D.C. when she was in her teens. So from that moment on, she was immersed in the political milieu of the Capitol. She had, as far as we can tell, no formal education, but she was an absolutely brilliant woman, and life in Washington became her education. She married Robert Greenhow, who was a translator and librarian for the State Department in 1835, and quickly established herself as a very prominent social hostess. Her elder sister, Ellen, married James Madison Cutts, who was the nephew of James and Dolly Madison. And I think that Dolly Madison's example as a politically influential hostess was a tremendous inspiration for Rose Greenhow. Rose's family connections also included Stephen Douglas. Her niece was Douglas's second wife. And through her eldest sister's marriage, she was connected to the Washington Custis Lee family. Her seized correspondence is now in the National Archives, and this really illustrates the depth and breadth of her connections in Washington. This is why she was effective as an espionage agent. And it was also why she believed that she would be able to get away with this, because she was so very well connected. John C. Calhoun was really Rose's political mentor. Throughout this presentation, you will see quotes in italics. These are from Rose Greenhow's 1863 memoir. She writes of Calhoun, "Mr. Calhoun had been the intimate friend of my husband and often our guest, having remained several months at a time with us during his senatorial sojourn at Washington. For many years, I have been honored by a correspondence with him, and it was my privilege to sit by his bedside and minister to him during his last illness, and to treasure in my heart his words of wisdom. And when he died, I followed his remains as one of his children to his last resting place." Calhoun, of course, was one of the real icons of pre-war politics, part of the great triumvirate, South Carolina representative, senator, secretary of war, vice president under two presidents, secretary of state. And in that position, he was very closely connected to Rose's husband, Robert. Calhoun did have a house in Washington for a short time, but he sold it because of the expense and regularly stayed at Hill's boarding house, run by Rose's aunt and uncle, where she lived as a teenager. Another connection that I don't think any of the biographers have noted was that his Washington home, Oakley, was purchased by the McCall family. And Lily McCall, the daughter of that family, whom Rose Greenhow discusses a great deal in her memoir, was born at Oakley, Calhoun's former home. Rose's eldest sister, Susan O'Neill Peter Leonard, named her only son, John Calhoun Peter. So there was certainly a connection there as well. And as I mentioned, Calhoun died at Hill's boarding house, which subsequently became the old Capitol Prison. "You are charged, madam, with holding communications with the enemy in the South. If this were an established fact, you could not be surprised at it." One of the striking things about Rose Greenhow, and one of the ways in which she was probably not a terribly effective espionage agent, is that she made no secret of her Southern sympathies. And because of this, she was very quickly recruited by Thomas Jordan prior to his resignation from the US Army as a Confederate agent in the spring of 1861. By the summer of 61, Jordan was serving on General Beauregard's staff, and Mrs. Greenhow, with her organization of agents, was providing information to Beauregard. Her greatest success was prior to the First Battle of Bull Run or Manassas. She obtained the Union Army's orders and forwarded these to Beauregard. She makes a number of other claims in her narrative as well. She states that she obtained information from federal officers, high-ranking politicians. She had verbatim reports of Lincoln's cabinet meetings. We'll come back to that later. And she warned several prominent Southern sympathizers of their impending arrests in time for them to leave and evade being arrested. And she also says that McClellan was forced to change his plans 4 times because of her espionage network. How much of this is boasting? How much of this can we really believe? That was one of the questions that I set out to answer in my research as well. Rose Greenhow has gotten kind of a bad rap in the last few years. People saying, oh, she really wasn't terribly effective. They knew everything she sent them anyway. And to some extent, that may have been true about Manassas, but that was not the only thing she did in her espionage work. These are some of her suspected sources of information. Senator Henry Wilson usually takes the blame, Republican from Massachusetts. But she certainly was also obtaining information from Captain John Elwood of the Provost Marshal's office and General Erasmus Keyes, who incidentally is buried at West Point, and I go over and visit him on my walks at the cemetery at lunch. Rose was arrested on August 23rd, 1861 in Washington City. So not about a month after her big success with the first Battle of Bull Run. She wrote, "On Friday, August 23rd in Washington City, the metropolis of this once free and happy land, the proud boast of which was that life, liberty, and property were protected by the law, I was made a prisoner in my own house and subjected to an ordeal which must have been copied from the days of the Directory in France." And this very grandiose sort of language is something that we find a great deal of in Rose's writing. She was arrested by Allen Pinkerton and his agents, who were operating under orders from both the Departments of War and State. Now, Rose Greenhow firmly believed that her arrest was due to the orders of William Seward, who had been one of her very close friends prior to the war. However, my research revealed that that was not the case. The actual order was issued by the Assistant Secretary of War, Thomas Scott. Rose almost certainly did not know that, and she blamed Seward. The language in regard to Seward is very personal and very bitter. She was confined first at her home and then in the old Capitol prison from August of 1861 until June of 1862. And her youngest daughter was also imprisoned. This is the iconic image of the two of them in the old Capitol prison. Little Rose turned 9 in the prison. And Rose Greenhow said that she was never consulted on the subject of having her child in prison. She was never given an alternative. The child was not considered a prisoner, but she was subject to all the rules and regulations of the prison. Rose Greenhow herself was never brought to trial. And she claims that that was because she would have reserved the right to defend herself and there would have been rich revelations. She did receive a hearing before the US commissioners for the trial of state prisoners, one of whom had formerly been a frequent guest at her dinner table. Following her release from prison, she was sent south to Richmond. She didn't stay there very well, even though the conditions of her parole were that she was not to return to Union territory. And she abided by that mostly, although she happened to be in Winchester, Virginia at the time of the Battle of Antietam, which to me is highly interesting. And she was also there in company with Alexander Butler, who was a known courier for General Jackson. Was this just a social call to her sister-in-law in Winchester that happened to be at exactly the same time? I have a hunch that it wasn't, but I haven't quite been able to prove that one yet. When she arrived in Richmond, Jefferson Davis, who had known her for many years, wrote that she was much changed and has the air of one whose nerves were shaken by mental torture. However, he determined to send her on a diplomatic mission to Europe. She left in August of 1863. This is really striking. Her biographer, Ann Blackman, argues that Rose Greenhow was the first American-born woman to officially represent her government overseas. But that government happened to be the Confederacy, and so she doesn't receive a whole lot of credit for her diplomatic work. It absolutely was an official appointment. Confederate Secretary of the Navy, Stephen Mallory, referred to her as our ambassadress in his correspondence. She met with leading politicians in Britain, may even have become engaged to one of them, and she had a private audience with Napoleon III in France, and by special diplomatic arrangement was permitted to attend a dinner with the emperor and the diplomatic corps. She worked extensively with other Confederate agents in Europe, including James D. Bullock. She took her daughter, her youngest daughter, Rose, who had been in prison, with her to Europe and enrolled her in a convent school in France. And as I mentioned, she was rumored to be engaged to Granville George Lusengore, the second Earl of Granville, who was a very influential and very anti-Confederate British politician. While in Europe, Rose Greenhow published My Imprisonment, which is the book which I have produced the annotated scholarly edition of. The book was published on November 6th, 1863 by Richard Bentley, publisher and ordinary to Her Majesty, who also published Dickens and Disraeli and Hans Christian Andersen and a host of well-known authors. This book was not really one of their finest productions, though. There were a lot of signs of rushing to press. Rose didn't spell particularly well, and her British editor didn't always recognize the individuals she was alluding to. So many of the names in the book are misspelled. And it took from the time of the 1863 publication until the publication of my annotated edition to identify who some of these people actually were. And a lot of that was through saying things out loud and trying to track down people phonetically. There are a couple of them that still have eluded me, but I found a lot of them. I believe she wrote this book prior to her departure for Europe, during that period from her release from prison until she left in August. She doesn't discuss the book much in the diary she kept in her time in Europe. She doesn't discuss meeting with the publisher at all. The book is very rare now. This is my personal copy, and you can see it's not in terribly good condition, but I spent well over a decade looking for a copy of this book. Ann Blackman hired a rare book dealer to find her copy. I just set up an automatic notification on eBay and waited and waited and waited and waited. And then it showed up with a buy it now button, click, and it was mine. This is the last known image of Rose Greenhow. And the gentleman with her is very likely Lieutenant Joe Wilson of the CSS Alabama, whose parole she helped to arrange. There are images of Wilson in uniform, and I've put this through some software programs which enhance the photo and correct some of the little errors. And now the resemblance to Wilson in those other images is even more obvious. She left Europe August 10th, 1864, on the maiden voyage of the blockade runner Condor. The ship arrived in Halifax in early September and stayed there for several weeks, a period of her life which no one has really researched, which I find very interesting, especially considering some of the sort of clandestine Confederate operations in Canada at that time. They departed about 3 weeks later. During the time she was there, the Union Secretary of State, William Seward, her former friend, was sent warning from one of his agents in Halifax that she was on board the Condor, and the Condor would be attempting to run the blockade at Wilmington, North Carolina. It was Seward who issued orders to make sure that the ship was intercepted. In addition to Mrs. Greenhow, passengers on the Condor included the Confederate Commissioner to Canada, James Holcomb, and that same Lieutenant Wilson of the CSS Alabama, whose parole Rose had helped to secure and who is pictured in this last image of her. She drowned on October 1st, 1864, attempting to run the blockade. The ship ran aground, and for years I've been saying it was about 700 yards from shore. I was just in Wilmington in June, where I met with Chris Fondle, who is one of the real experts on Fort Fisher. And Chris told me that because of shore erosion, at the time of Rose Greenhow's death, she was actually only 500 yards from shore. The ship was under the protection of the guns of Fort Fisher. All they had to do was wait for the tide to rise, and they very likely would have been able to make it in. But Rose was not willing to wait. She convinced the captain to put her out in a small rowboat with several men. The rowboat capsized. All of the men made it to shore. Rose Greenhow did not. And of course, the romantic legend is that she had gold sewn into the hem of her dress, the proceeds of the publication of her book, which dragged her to the bottom and she drowned. First of all, the currents there are very, very hazardous. There are still signs up not to swim in that area. It was the middle of the night. She was out on a rowboat. She was dressed in garments that would have made it very difficult to swim. And given where she came from and her social background, both Dr. Fonville and I think it very likely that she didn't even know how to swim. Swimming was not a popular recreation for 19th century women, which very well may explain why all of the men made it to shore and she did not. For Lieutenant Wilson, though, I mean, he'd been on the sinking of the Alabama, now he's at the rowboat with her. Just a very unlucky young gentleman. She was buried with full military honors in Oakdale Cemetery in Wilmington, North Carolina. And the wreck of the Condor is now an underwater museum. If you are a scuba diver, you can go visit it. So here are some of the things which I found particularly fascinating in my research. I uncovered Rose Greenhow's meeting with future Confederate nurse Fanny Beers in July of 1861. Dr. Chris Fonville gave me a photo of Rose's trunk, which is in Wilmington, and I got to see it when I was there in June. One of the few material objects which we have direct connection through provenance with her. It was sold at auction following her death. I uncovered her family connections with Visitation Academy in Georgetown and with its founder, Archbishop Neal, who was a relative of hers. And this one was a lot of fun. She had a first cousin who was a Union general. You think someone might have noticed that before. Also, the connection of a prisoner shooting at the old Capitol to John Wilkes Booth. Rose Greenhow's legal strategy, which was really pretty clever, although she couldn't find an attorney who would go along with it. Correspondence between the Seward and Greenhow families, including an extremely odd letter from Rose's eldest daughter, Florence, to William H. Seward in 1864, while her mother was on a diplomatic mission in Europe. Potential identification of the diplomat who accompanied Rose Greenhow on her promenade moments before Allan Pinkerton arrested her. The Greenhow-Jordan espionage ring's involvement with the Battle of Port Royal, identification of members of the spy ring and prisoners at the old Capitol, and more. So let me introduce you to Rose Greenhow's first cousin, the Union general. This is Bennett Hoskin Hill. She wrote in my imprisonment, many members of my immediate family sided with the despot, that would be Lincoln, and held high official position under him. Her biographers have noted that some of those relations include her nephew, James Madison Cutts Jr., her son-in-law, Treadwell Moore, but nobody mentions this gentleman, Bennett Hoskin Hill. He was the son of the aunt and uncle with whom she lived in Washington, the ones who ran the boarding house. He was a member of the West Point class of 1837, so his classmates included Braxton Bragg, Jubal Early, John C. Pemberton, and Joseph Hooker. And classes then were very small. There were 50 men in this graduating class, so certainly they all knew each other pretty well. He was a career Army officer and a Mexican War veteran, served as a recruitment officer, and was made Brevet Brigadier General by the end of the war. He retired from active service in 1870 and is buried in Washington, D.C. And if you're familiar with the images of Rose Greenhow, there certainly is a pretty strong family resemblance there, being first cousins on the maternal side. Jessie Wharton. Rose Greenhow wrote, this very hour, 11 o'clock, a prisoner, Mr. Wharton of Maryland, has been murdered in cold blood by a sentry. That's all I had. Who was this Mr. Wharton? Well, I found him. Jesse Barnes Wharton, former U.S. Army officer, was arrested in December 61, shot by Old Capitol prison guard Ambrose Baker on April 18, 1862. which was Good Friday. Wharton was a childhood friend of John Wilkes Booth, and we have this on authority of Booth's sister Asia. And they had attended school together. They didn't just happen to attend school. We do know that they knew each other quite well, and they were both involved in a student mutiny at St. Timothy's Hall. Curious, isn't it, that Booth's childhood friend was shot in the old Capitol prison on Good Friday? So Rose Greenhow claims, I might almost be said to have assisted at Lincoln's cabinet councils from the facilities I enjoyed, having verbatim reports of them. Pretty striking claim. She's certainly implementing a cabinet member here, but which one? And there were a few suspects. Gideon Wells lived directly around the corner from her. They were practically neighbors. Letters from Salmon Chase were found in her house, partially destroyed upon her arrest, and also letters to William Seward. Her brother-in-law, James Madison Cox, the nephew of President Madison, worked in the Treasury Department. But most of the factors which I investigated point pretty convincingly towards Seward as the source of this information. Certainly, I don't think Seward realized that Mrs. Greenhow was a Confederate agent, but he likely was speaking very freely to her in the very early war period. Rose Greenhow writes, I had known Seward intimately, and he had frequently enjoyed the hospitalities of my table. She describes an incident in 1860 where there was an explosion at her dinner table involving the wife of Charles Francis Adams, son and grandson of presidents, over the John Brown raid. Seward was there as well and helped to smooth things over. I found, completely by accident, several letters from Rose's eldest daughter, Florence Greenhow Moore, to Seward in the Seward family correspondence, indicating that Seward, Lady Napier, the wife of the British minister to the United States, Florence, were all part of the same social circles. Rose pretty clearly points the finger at Seward. Mr. Secretary Seward, who in the morning is the most reticent of gentlemen, is, after supper, and under the influences of the generous gifts which the gods provide, the most genial and confidential. I have often had occasion to admire the confidingness of his nature on these occasions, and wondered if the judgment of the world was correct in ascribing to him the character of a subtle schemer and tortuous intriguer. Now, we could just dismiss this as boasting, and in fact, many scholars have, except that we find Charles Francis Adams Jr., who was very pro-Seward, saying something quite similar at the same time. At times, his brandy and water would excite him and set his tongue going with dangerous volubility. Seward was under a great deal of pressure. He was drinking heavily, and when he drank, he had a tendency to be less guarded in his words. Did Rose Greenhow take advantage of this? Very possibly. He happened to live only 5 minutes from her house. In the summer of 1861, he moved into the former clubhouse on Lafayette Square. Rose Greenhow also wrote to William H. Seward several times during her imprisonment, and he answered her at least once. There are scores of references to Seward in my imprisonment, and that was one of the things that really struck me when I was going through the book. Her bitterness was directed towards Seward in particular, and it is clear that it was very personal and very deeply felt. We know that Rose was seeking to influence Seward well before the period she was a Confederate agent. January 10th, 1861, her attorney Edward Pringle writes, perhaps after all, thanks to Seward and Wilson, that would be Senator Wilson of Massachusetts, you may do more with the incoming than with the outgoing powers. Now that is a striking statement, given that the outgoing powers were her friend, James Buchanan, and she'd spent the summer of 1849 at his house. But somehow, thanks to Seward and Wilson, she was going to have even more influence with the Lincoln administration. We know that Rose was recommending candidates to Seward to put before Lincoln in February of 1861. She was trying to get an appointment for her son-in-law in the quartermaster department in San Francisco in April of 1861. And this is what she writes to Seward about her son-in-law and her daughter. Captain Moore is a strong Union man and holds himself ready to obey the orders of the federal government. His wife, her daughter, as you know, is a Sewardite. My good friend, I have this very much at heart, and will hold myself greatly your debtor if it is accomplished. Moore got the appointment. That copy of Rose Greenhow's letter to Seward was found partially destroyed in her library, torn up in the fireplace at the time of her arrest. The copy she sent to Seward is in the Seward family correspondence. Now, in addition to her involvement with the Battle of Manassas, Rose Greenhow also claimed to have been involved in providing information pertaining to the Battle of Port Royal. There are a couple things that are really striking about this. First of all, she once again points the finger at Seward. It was upon one of these festive occasions, when the mind of the great statesman had become properly attuned, that he addressed himself to the task of indoctrinating a distinguished foreign representative and assuring him that in 30 days, a favorite period of his, the rebellion would be crushed out, demonstrating this melancholy fact by describing in detail this invincible armada and the devastating course it was predestined to take. This important information was conveyed to me by my little bird. So here we have.
I'm very sorry to interrupt. We have a blue Ford parked outside that is keeping one of our patrons here from being able to get into their own car. Blue Ford license plate PZB 3625. Is that you? Would you be able to move? And I'm very sorry. Thank you. I'm so sorry.
So here we have Rose Greenhow in prison, Seward boasting to foreign diplomats, and Rose Greenhow still obtaining that information and conveying it to the South by my little bird. Now, if you've read the biographies of Rose Greenhow, most people suspect that my little bird is her daughter, the youngest one, the 8-year-old. But that makes no sense, because the child is also imprisoned at this time and is certainly not at dinner parties with Seward and a French diplomat. So what is going on here? My little bird was clearly someone else who moved in these social circles in Washington. Rose was still able to get information out. She obtained, through Seward's loose lips, knowledge of the planned combined assault of Port Royal Sound in South Carolina by the Army and Navy. This was the largest fleet that had ever sailed under the US flag to that point, 77 vessels. And the captains of those vessels did not know what their orders were until they sailed. Absolute secrecy was maintained. And yet, Judah Benjamin in Richmond knew where the fleet was going. How did he know that? My little bird. The Greenhow Jordan spy ring was still active, even with Rose Greenhow in prison. The ships of this fleet, however, were battered by storms. So this mission was not as successful as they might have hoped, not because the Confederacy was forewarned, but simply because of the weather. I mentioned that Rose Greenhow wrote to Seward while she was in prison. And here are some of those letters. The most famous one is the letter from November 17th, 1861. This was widely reprinted by the press. And Rose Greenhow admitted that she had sent one copy to Seward and one copy to the Richmond Whig, which made itself from there into quite a number of other newspapers. I was looking for the copy she sent to Seward because I wondered if it really was the same as the copy she sent to the newspaper. I wrote to the Seward family correspondence housed in a collection in Rochester. They didn't have it. But they did have several other letters which were very interesting, and we'll come to that in a moment. 2 weeks after the final edits for my book were submitted, that letter that she sent to Seward came up for auction. It had been in a private collection. I might have told a couple of collections about it, one of which has been able to obtain it, and it is now with the Seward family correspondence where I was looking for it in the first place. I compared the digital images from the auction line by line with what had been published in the newspapers in 1861. And my hunch was right. The copy she sent to Seward included some passages that were not in the copy she sent to the Richmond Whig. And this one here in bold was really striking to me. My own convictions are that the only chance of our ever again being one people is in the capacity of the South to maintain herself. Then negotiations can be entered into for adjustment, which can bind us together stronger than ever, not as conqueror or conquered, but as brothers who have quarreled and are willing each to yield something for the blessings of fraternal intercourse once more. This doesn't sound much like Rose Greenhow, the Confederate martyr, does it? But she was writing to Seward, and she knew him, and she knew this would appeal to him. She was very politically savvy, and Seward was a very close friend. But then she goes on, "You have held me, sir, to a man's accountability, and I therefore claim the right to speak on subjects usually considered beyond a woman's ken, which you may class as errors of opinion." Rose Greenhow was not afraid to discuss political matters with men, and they seemed to have listened. This letter is full of a lot of Rose's grand pronouncements as well. And she says to Seward at one point that you may subject me to harsher, ruder treatment than I have already received, but you cannot imprison the soul. That is much more of the language that we find from her in other sources. I can completely understand why she didn't put that passage about reconciliation in the copy that she sent to a newspaper in the Confederacy. Seward didn't respond to this one, but he did respond to her appeal in early December 1861 to visit her dying friend, Lily McCall. He refused. But he says, "The Provost Marshal will please inform Mrs. Greenhow that in consequence of her correspondence with the general commanding the armies now besieging Washington, her request to visit the house of Mrs. McCall cannot be complied with, as it would be an interference with military arrangements." And Seward surely knew that he had probably said more than he should have to Mrs. Greenhow. And I can well imagine that he wanted to keep her under lock and key and keep her out of the press as much as possible. She wrote to him again in December of 1861. And within a very short period of time from that letter, she was transferred from house arrest to the old Capitol prison. interestingly, that transfer also specified that she is being transferred from the custody of the State Department, Seward, to the custody of the War Department. Interesting, isn't it? Here are those other letters that I found completely by mistake when I was looking for the copy of the letter she sent to Seward and the Seward family correspondence. They had several letters from her eldest daughter, Florence, to Seward. Florence's husband was a West Point classmate of Seward's son, Augustus. They were class of 1847, which was only 38 men. These days, we graduate about 1,000 cadets every year. So very different then. I have about 38 cadets in my choir. Believe me, they knew each other. These letters indicate a pre-war friendship between Florence and Seward. She writes, "We wish so often you were here to drive with us and make us laugh," in 1859. She writes to Seward about travel, gardening, things that he was very, very interested in. But the most striking letter to me is from May of 1864. At this point, Florence's mother is in Europe on an official diplomatic mission for the Confederacy. She has already published her memoir, which contains scores of harsh comments about Seward. And yet Florence, Rose's daughter, wrote to Seward asking him to give her letters of introduction to the US ministers in London and Paris because she was going to see Mama. That is awfully cheeky, isn't it? We don't know if she got the letters, but she did go to Europe, so she may have. One line really stood out to me, and it made me wonder about what else had gone on between Florence and Seward, especially during the period after her mother's arrest, because clearly they had had a conversation or they had exchanged some letters that we don't have. Because she writes, "You know, you reminded me of your promise to take care of me. So I hope you will not think I am asking too great a favor." This completely changed everything that I knew about the connection between Rose and Seward. And it is something that none of the biographers ever found. This close connection between Florence and Seward, to the extent that Florence could still ask Seward for these letters, and that he had made a promise to take care of her. Now we come to Rose's connection to another member of Lincoln's cabinet, Edwin Stanton. While Rose was under house arrest, Stanton came to see her. She writes, "Mr. Stanton came also to see me. I had, of course, no idea of the position he was subsequently to hold in the abolition cabinet. Neither had he at that time." This was in the fall of 1861. "I now wish to employ him as my counsel to obtain a writ of habeas corpus." This he declined, accompanied by expressions of high appreciation and proffer of service in any other way, to which I, of course, attached no value. So let's look at this for a moment. Edwin Stanton, one of the top legal minds of the era, comes to see Rose Greenhow in prison, and she tries to hire him to challenge the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Stanton refused, and a few months later, he's appointed to Lincoln's cabinet. Rose had already encountered Stanton in two other high-profile cases. The Lemantor land claims case. Her husband had been involved in investigating those land claims just before his death in California, and the trial of Daniel Sickles for the murder of Philip Barton Key. Now, Sickles received an anonymous letter telling him of his wife's infidelity, which caused him to shoot Key in cold blood on the street 5 minutes from Rose Greenhow's house. At the time, it was widely believed that Rose Greenhow was the author of that anonymous letter. Now, I've looked at it, the handwriting doesn't match. And one of the authors who's written widely on this whole Sickles Key incident hired a handwriting expert to do the same thing and came to the same conclusion. But Rose Greenhow absolutely knew everyone, all the principal players in the Sickles Key incident. In fact, Key and Mrs. Sickles had been at her house a couple of days before the murder. This was when Stanton successfully, for the first time, employed the defense of temporary insanity. He was at Rose Greenhow's house not only to see her, but also to see Eugenia Phillips, another suspected Confederate spy who was imprisoned there. Eugenia's husband, Philip Phillips, had also been part of the Sickles defense team. These circles were very tight and very interconnected. If Stanton had agreed to pursue Rose Greenhow's strategy of challenging the suspension of habeas corpus, this would have been sensational legal news. But he refused. So we can only speculate at what that might have done. There are several scholars who claim that Rose Greenhow was not an effective spy. And yet, if we look at her contemporaries on both sides of the conflict, they disagree. Jefferson Davis and Alan Pinkerton both considered her highly effective and extremely dangerous to the Union. And it is important to remember that the intelligence that she provided prior to the First Battle of Bull Run was not the only thing her espionage ring did. One of the chief arguments against her effectiveness is, well, we don't have these papers that support some of the things she claims she did, or that Pinkerton claims she did, or that the Confederacy claims she did. And yet Rose Greenhow very clearly states that she destroyed her most important papers. Espionage is, by its very nature, something murky. We cannot know for certain, but we cannot discount the evaluations of her contemporaries so easily. The Confederate government paid her a vast sum in recognition of her valuable and patriotic service. This was a sum considerably larger than any other female spy had received. And I don't think they did it just because they had known her before the war. I think they valued her espionage work to that extent. They also would not have sent her to Europe if they didn't think that she was effective. That was an expensive mission as well. So they are just throwing money at Rose Greenhow. And if she just was some society lady who told them what they already knew, why bother? So the book. The book is Rose Greenhow's 1863 memoir, the first scholarly edition. It includes 593 annotations that identify people, events, literary, political, and historical references, and goodness, was that woman well read. And it includes several significant contributions to scholarship on Greenhow, some of which I've outlined in this presentation. There's also an introduction, there's a full appendix. There was an appendix about a full index and an appendix about these letters between Florence and Seward. There are illustrations. So when Rose Greenhow talks about someone, you see them there. I believed this book was needed. I believed that her manuscript, her memoirs had kind of been given short shrift because she was the victim of her own notoriety. I thought it was a truly striking insight into early war Washington from the perspective of a very well-connected woman. I was utterly shocked, however, that it was the #1 new release in Amazon's US Civil War Women's History category for about 3 weeks when it was released in May 2021. I believed that it was an important and valuable contribution to scholarship, but I didn't think it would be popular. And yet it's now in the 3rd printing, and there are plans for a paperback release next year, in which I can finally put in what I found about the original copy of the letter that she sent to Seward that came to like 2 weeks after the hardcover the final edits were sent in. Here's a glimpse inside the book. It was very, very important to me that the footnotes were on the same page so that you don't have to constantly flip to the back of the book. You're able to follow the flow of her narrative and get the supplemental information that is necessary to provide context to the modern reader. Here, for example, we see she's talking about her relationship with Buchanan. We have Buchanan on the page. She mentions spending time at his house, Wheatland, and in the footnote, I identified the letter to his nephew, which talks about how she and her daughters had spent the summer of 1849 staying at his house with him. So this gives us the context, and it gives us a visual glimpse into her world. Rose Greenhow was a brilliant and knowledgeable woman, but she assumed that her readers would recognize references which may be obscure to modern readers, and quite frankly, might have been rather obscure to her readers in 1863 as well. This book is the product of nearly 25 years of research. I also happen to portray Rose Greenhow. And here we have the side-by-side of my portrayal and the woman herself. I have presented this portrayal in 14 states in Washington, D.C. And when I met Ann Blackman in 2004, just before the release of her biography, we both thought we had unearthed some sources that nobody else had ever seen. And it turns out that the only other anybody else was the other one of us. Of course, now that Ann's book has been out for a number of years, those sources are very easily identifiable simply by looking at her references. In the years since the publication of Ann's book, I have continued to make new discoveries. And many of the things that I have unearthed are included in the annotated edition of my Imprisonment. Rose Greenhow was and is one of the best known spies of the Civil War, but she was a lot more than that. And that is made amply clear through detailed study of her own words and her own account of her experiences. She was on a diplomatic mission. This book was clearly intended as propaganda to sway the British, but it nevertheless gives us insights into wartime Washington that are just fascinating. And I hope that through the publication of this annotated edition, Rose Greenhow will finally get some of the scholarly attention that she really deserves, rather than merely being dismissed as a Southern seductress and spy. And I should be happy to take your questions. Yes.
She was a widow during the entire war.
Yes.
Is there any suggestion that there was a romantic relationship with any of those men that she
There,
relationship with?
yes, there was certainly a suggestion that, as she put it, she used every capacity with which God had endowed her in gathering information. And I think we have a pretty clear idea of what that was. There are seized letters in the National Archives, which are undoubtedly love letters. They're on congressional stationery. They're signed only with the initial H. And most people believe that it is Henry Wilson who wrote those letters. There's some question about whether the handwriting matches. I have looked at the H letters for a long time, and I've gone back and forth on them. At the moment, I really do think it is Wilson. There are so many things, so many contextual clues in those letters which connect with Wilson, which makes sense with what we know about his interests and the timeline of his life. Whether she had any romantic feelings towards him or whether she was just using him for information, we don't know. There is a suggestion that, and this comes from Jessie Benton Fremont, that she may have had a romantic entanglement with Erasmus Keyes, who was a widower. And certainly while she was in Europe, there were some suggestions that she was engaged, possibly to Lord Granville. Also, interestingly enough, the family of Lieutenant Wilson from the Alabama claims that he was desperately in love with her and absolutely heartbroken when she drowned. Lieutenant Wilson was the age of her older children, but it's possible. Yes.
She supported herself and her children.
Well, her husband's family was wealthy, so certainly she had some income from his estate. She also received a pretty substantial settlement from the city of San Francisco for his accidental death, and an even larger settlement from Congress because he was there on government business. That settlement was larger than the pension that Mary Lincoln received for the death of Abraham Lincoln. Even before the war, Rose Greenhow had friends in high places. Of course, after she was arrested and subsequently released, the Confederate government was essentially funding her. And they were funding her on a pretty large scale. When she arrived in Europe, the first thing that she did was she went to Trenholm's office. They were the British bankers. Well, he was from South Carolina, but they were funding a lot of the Confederate operations in Europe. So she went to Trenholm's bank. She is given a large sum, and she immediately went shopping so that she would be in proper tact to assume her new diplomatic role in Europe. And the government cheerfully bankrolled all of this for her. Yes.
She wasn't very formally educated.
Not at all, not that I found.
She seemed to write very well and use language that would suggest that she was very educated.
Yes.
Was that of her own study and so on?
That is something that I really have wanted to conclusively determine. The literary references, the references to the Bible, to Shakespeare, the historical references to some very obscure incidents, all suggest that she was an extremely well-read woman. So how much of this had she just gleaned through her own readings? How much of it had she gleaned moving in high circles? Her husband was a brilliant man. He spoke 7 languages. He'd been educated in Europe, so some of it might have been his influence. There is also a family connection with Visitation Academy in Georgetown, which was an elite school for young women. James Buchanan's niece, Harriet Lane, attended it. 2 of Rose's daughters attended it. I was in touch with them to see if there is any indication that she might have received some formal education there. She was related to Archbishop Neal, who was one of the founders, and so certainly it seems possible, but their records don't go back that far. So we don't know. It is entirely possible that she did receive some sort of training there. And the kind of woman she became is very much in line with what we see with some other graduates of Visitation Academy. So that's certainly possible as well. Yes.
You alluded to John Calhoun, and that he died in 1850. What was her relationship with that Calhoun at the time?
There were a lot of connections. He had stayed at her aunt and uncle's boarding house quite frequently, so she had known him from the time she was a girl. Her sister named her son after him, so there was that connection as well. Rose's husband, Robert Greenhow, was very close to Calhoun. Robert's brother edited a pro-Calhoun newspaper in Virginia. So they were all interconnected. But Calhoun seems very specifically to have been close to Rose. And she was accorded a position of honor with his family in his funeral procession. So this was not just something that we have her word for. This was something that was recognized at the time. Now we have to ask, young, attractive teenage girl, powerful politician, is something else going on here? And we don't know. We don't know if Calhoun's relationship with her was purely avuncular or if there was some other component to it. But certainly Calhoun was the predominant political influence on Rose Greenhow. And I think it was that early connection with Calhoun which created in her the convictions that led her eventually to become a Confederate agent and diplomat.
He, I visited his grave many years ago in South Carolina, in Charleston. And he's buried across the street from the church where his wife buried. And according to the time back then, he wasn't a member of Charleston Society.
No, he wasn't.
And from upstate New York, or I mean
South Carolina, yeah.
And, so he wasn't entitled to be. Is that's still what?
There certainly was a sense that Calhoun was not quite from the right circles in South Carolina, and yet he had rose to such prominence and such power that he was, and in some circles really is, still very much revered as one of the key South Carolina politicians of the period. Yes?
Was the two girls the only children?
She had 8 children altogether. By the time of the war, only 3 of them were alive. The 2 sons died quite young. There were 2 other daughters who died very young. The eldest daughter was Florence, who married Treadwell Moore, who was serving in the Union Army and who wrote those letters to Seward. The next eldest daughter was Gertrude, who died in March of 1861. So when we see the image of Rose Greenhow in the old Capitol in the black dress, that is mourning that she is wearing for her daughter Gertrude. Then there was Leela, and I find Leela very interesting. The biographers sort of regard her as the shadowy figure. And yet in the diary of Mary Greenhow Lee, Rose's sister-in-law, who lived in Winchester during the war, she writes a number of times about Leela. She says that Leela is very decidedly for the Union. And at one point she says that she is in a convent in Wheeling, which is actually the first contact I had with John Eric, was trying to track down what was going on with Leela in this convent. Leela eventually, whatever happens, whether she was considering a vocation to religious life at that point, she eventually does not become a nun. She marries and she lies about her age, making herself considerably younger than she actually was, because her husband was a bit younger than she actually was. So in that regard, she takes after her mother. Leela was sent in July of 1861 to be with her elder sister Florence, who was in the Utah Territory at that point. Florence was expecting a baby, so that makes sense. You send the next eldest surviving daughter to help take care of her sister. But I also wonder how much of Leela being sent away had to do with the fact that she was very decidedly pro-Union and she was getting in her mother's way. And then, of course, there was little Rose, who shared her mother's imprisonment, who was in the convent school in Paris when her mother died, and who, according to the Mother Superior, wept without ceasing for days because she had no one left. She had never known her father. She had shared all of those harsh experiences in prison with her mother, and now she was alone in a foreign land. Eventually, she came back to the United States, lived with her eldest sister, Florence, and Florence's husband. She married a West Point graduate as well, just like Florence had. The marriage was not a happy one. They had 2 children, one of whom survived to adulthood. The other one is an infant who is buried in the West Point Cemetery. And I visit him on my lunchtime walks too.
Are there any descendants?
No. Little Rose, Florence, and Leela all had children, but all three of those lines died out somewhere around the 1950s or 1960s.
All right. Everyone, I think that's a good place to wrap, but please catch up with Emily back here. It was a wonderful talk. Yeah, I will do questions today. We have a few people watching. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming, everyone. Please make sure to come back next month, October 8th. If you'd like to check out the podcast before our meeting next month, it is addressinggettysburg.com. So check